Hi, I'm Chris Sangster, and welcome back to the studio. Today, I'm starting a new video series called What Are They Emulating? Plugins that emulate analog hardware are all over the place in the modern music production world, and I, for one, absolutely love them. But because of copyright protections or marketing reasons, most of these plugins just have tongue-in-cheek names that kind of hint at the classic hardware they're emulating, but don't come right out and say exactly what they're supposed to sound like. And I don't feel like there's a great resource out there that aims to demystify what all these plugins are actually trying to sound like, so I decided to start this series. I think it's also a good opportunity for me to dive a little deeper into what makes these machines what they are and what makes them so special. So for our first episode of What Are They Emulating, we are going to look at a plugin that we are all very familiar with, and that is the Logic Pro Stock Compressor Plugin. The Logic Compressor Plugin has 7 different modes, and 6 of them aim to emulate a famous hardware compressor. The default and first mode is called Platinum Digital, and it is not emulating any specific piece of hardware. In fact, it is designed to be the antithesis of that. It is a purely digital creation that aims to have the most transparent sound possible. Because analog hardware is comprised of a complex network of electrical components that the audio signal has to pass through, each piece of hardware will impart some type of sonic imprint, usually referred to as color or warmth, onto the signal. In the cases of these famous compressors, that sonic imprint is very desirable, and it's a big part of the secret sauce that all of these plugins are trying to emulate. But we may not want that color on all of our musical sources, and so for that we have clean, transparent digital compressors. Think of Platinum Digital as the sibling to Logic Pro's EQ plugin, in that they are both clean, transparent, and not attempting to emulate any piece of hardware. The first emulation mode in the compressor plugin is called Studio VCA. It is an emulation of the Focusrite Red 3 dual compressor limiter. Focusrite was founded by Rupert Neve, yes, that Rupert Neve, in 1985, and 10 years later they released the Red 3 dual compressor limiter. This red beauty came to fame on the mixes of Michael Brower and Chris Lord-Alge. It uses a voltage-controlled amplifier to achieve the compression effect, hence the name in Logic Pro, Studio VCA. Because of the use of VCAs, it offers user-selectable attack and release times, as well as very low noise and distortion. It also generally will add more color to the sound as compression increases, and operates quite transparently at low levels of gain reduction. The Focusrite Red 3 was quite a unique beast at the time it was released because of the way it offered compression and limiting on 2 separate VCAs. Most compressor limiters operate in a way where the compression circuit turns into hard limiting at high ratios. But the Red 3 actually uses a separate VCA altogether to handle the limiting. Combine this with its ability to handle stereo signals and to link the left and right channels together at the press of a button, and you have a very versatile piece of studio gear that sounds great on a multitude of sources. Personally, I'm a big fan of Focusrite Red compressor emulations on drum overhead mics. The next mode in the lineup is called Studio FET, and this is emulating what very well may be the most famous piece of studio gear of all time, the Universal Audio 1176 peak limiter. Specifically, it's emulating the UREI/UA 1176 blackface revisions. Universal Audio was founded by Bill Putnam Sr. in 1958 as the manufacturing arm of his recording company, United Recording Corporation. Through several mergers and acquisitions, by 1967 it was renamed United Recording Electronics Industries, UREI, and in 1968 UREI developed the 1176 peak limiter. So the 1176 peak limiter has gone through 10 revisions in its 55-year lifespan and has inspired countless copycats. The black faceplate from which this version takes its nickname was incorporated in revisions C through G. And so it's that generation of the 1176 that's being emulated here in Logic. Like all 1176s, the blackface models use field effect transistors in its compression circuit, which is where we get the name Studio FET. The design of the 1176 is quite a unique one, with its incredibly fast attack time and program-dependent release times. Even though you can set the release time on the unit, the release is quicker after transients to obtain a more consistent level, but slows down after sustained heavy compression to reduce pumping. So it doesn't always stay at the level you set. It kind of varies a bit around that level you set based on the signal it's compressing. It also includes 4 ratios selectable on buttons, and the misuse of these buttons led to perhaps its most famous feature. British engineers discovered that it was possible to push all 4 buttons in at once, achieving an extreme level of compression and an increase in harmonic distortion. Chances are you've heard this on your favorite records or you've used it yourself in your own recordings. Unfortunately, the Logic Pro emulation doesn't have an all buttons in feature. I really wish they'd add one, but you can try to recreate it by cranking the ratio all the way up and bringing the threshold down so it compresses the signal significantly. So this is one compressor where I actually have used the vintage hardware, the modern hardware, and most of the plugin emulations. And honestly, they're all great. The 1176 has a thing, it does its thing sounds awesome. For me, I love it as a first stage compressor on vocals. Next up, we have the classic VCA, which is emulating a DBX160 compressor limiter. Another voltage controlled amplifier based compressor, so you kind of see where they're getting the names from. It's the type of electronics used to do the compression. The DBX160 was released in 1976 and gets its special sonic characteristics from the fact that it uses RMS level detection instead of peak level detection like most other compressors. David Blackmer, the founder of DBX, actually invented this RMS level detector, as well as a special kind of VCA, and these are what give the DBX160 its characteristic sound. Because RMS level detection more closely resembles the response of the human ear, it results in a more natural sounding style of compression. And because of this, the DBX160 features automatic attack and release settings. In fact, there are no user selectable attack and release settings at all on the DBX160. And this is actually reflected in the Logic compressor. Look, there's no attack and release knobs on this module. The DBX160 is also an example of what is called a feed-forward compressor. Unlike feedback compressors like the 1176, the DBX160 has its detector module placed before the gain reduction module in the circuit, which allows for much higher ratios of compression. In the case of the DBX160, it goes all the way up to 120 to 1. I kind of feel like the DBX160 doesn't get as much love as other vintage compressors from plugin manufacturers these days, but I love it on kick drums and on the drum bus, especially as a parallel compressor. That's actually probably my favorite way to use it. The fourth mode in the lineup is the Vintage VCA, and it is an emulation of the SSLG bus compressor. Originating in the famous solid-state Logic SL4000 mixing console, it's been called the glue button, the record maker, all sorts of other things. There's no doubt it's one of the most famous compressors ever. Solid-state logic was founded by Colin Sanders in 1969 as the first manufacturer of solid-state control systems for, of all things, pipe organs. However, by 1976, they had moved on to manufacturing mixing consoles, and in that year, they released the famous SL4000. The SSL SL4000 was the first large format mixing console to include dynamics processing on every channel and a master compressor in the center section. And it's this master compressor that has been emulated here in Logic. Specifically, it's the version from the G series of the console, which was released in 1987. The ability to patch into the console's center compressor and also to control its sidechain from an internal submix allowed engineers to discover the multitude of possibilities of this compressor. In fact, having sidechain detection on a mix bus compressor is an invaluable part of my own mixing workflow. When using the SSL emulation as a mix bus compressor, I like to roll off anything below 60 Hz on the sidechain. This allows the compressor to ignore the very lowest frequencies of the mix that can often cause overcompression. To do this in Logic, just click on the sidechain, turn the filter to on, change the mode to HP or high pass, and set the frequency to 60 Hz. I then generally aim for about 1 to 2 dBs of gain reduction with a slow attack time around 100 milliseconds and an auto release. This will achieve the famous mix glue sound. Next up, we have the vintage FET mode, which is actually a sibling of an emulation we've already looked at. Just like the studio FET model, this setting is emulating an 1176. There is some debate online as to whether this is emulating the earlier blue stripe models or the later silver face models of the 1176. While there's no way to really know for sure, I do believe Apple has given us a bit of a clue in the name. By calling the blackface model Studio FET, I think using the term vintage for the other 1176 emulation indicates that this is an older version of the 1176, which would be the blue stripe versions. The hardware versions of the blue stripe have an older version of the FETs and did not include a low noise circuit. I've heard anecdotally that the blue stripes are quite a bit noisier in use and do not contain as much of an aggressive mid-range sound as the blackface models do. In the Logic plugin, to be honest, I find the two 1176 emulations to sound pretty similar. The biggest difference is how much they compress at certain threshold settings. Check out this example where all of the settings remain the same, and you'll see that the Studio FET model compresses significantly more at this threshold setting than the vintage FET does. And here's what they sound like when their gain reduction is matched. Pretty similar. Honestly, all I'm really hearing is a bit more top end in the vintage FET model and maybe a little more weight to the mid-range and possibly the low end in the Studio FET model. Another slight quirk of the Logic compressor here is that we have a knee control on the vintage FET, but not on the Studio FET. The knee of a compressor is how strictly the start of the gain reduction sticks to the threshold. With a hard knee, the gain reduction starts at full ratio precisely when the signal crosses the threshold number. With a softer knee, the gain reduction begins a bit before the threshold with less ratio and ramps up to full ratio a bit after the threshold point. No versions of the hardware 1176 includes a knee control, but the knee of an 1176 does vary a bit based upon the input signal. So I suppose Apple wanted to give us that extra bit of control to kind of emulate that on the vintage FET. I'm not really sure, but with the Logic compressor, a setting of 0 is a hard knee, and a setting of 1 is the softest knee. On an 1176, it's a hard knee at the highest ratios and softer at lower ratios. And then finally, we have the Vintage Opto, which is an emulation of the Teletronics LA2A. The LA2A leveling amplifier was invented by James F. Lawrence II, founder of the Teletronics Engineering Company in the early 1960s. It was first released in 1962 by Teletronics, which in 1967 was bought by Bill Putnam's company, Studio Electronics. This resulted in the formation of the previously mentioned UREI. The LA2A is an optical compressor, hence the name Opto. This means that the gain reduction is achieved through a photo-optical detector circuit. In this, an electroluminescent panel lights up in response to the incoming audio signal. This is then seen by a light-dependent resistor, which changes resistance value, aka the level of your signal, in response to the light. Because of this design, it has program-dependent attack, release, and ratio settings, and each of these will change based upon the incoming signal. And this is also where the Logic Pro emulation differs considerably from the hardware, in that it contains user-selectable attack, release, and ratio knobs. While it's nice to have this extra functionality, I do think it takes away a bit of the LA2A-ness, if you will, of the emulation. Go for an attack time around 10 milliseconds, an auto or longer release time, a 4:1 ratio, and the soft distortion channel. That'll get you in the ballpark of the true LA2A sound. The characteristics of opto compressors like the LA2A make them an excellent choice for vocals or any solo lead instruments that you want to bolster in the mix, but still retain their transients. And it is my go-to second stage compressor for lead vocals. And that's it. Those are the famous hardware compressors that are being emulated in Logic Pro's stock compressor plugin. Of course, you do get many extra controls not found in the hardware versions in all of the Logic Pro emulations, like sidechain filtering, the ability to change the sidechain inputs, post-compression limiter, the different distortion modes, and a mix knob. Actually, I want to talk real quick about that distortion knob. While it's not necessary to use it in order to get the compression emulation that each different mode offers, it is helpful in getting some more of the saturation characteristics that each different hardware compressor offers. So there's 3 different modes: soft, hard, and clip. Here's how I would recommend using them in conjunction with the different compressor modes. To start off with the clip mode, honestly, I don't really use it much at all. I don't find that it sounds very good on many sources, and it doesn't really make sense to me to have hard clipping happening in order to try to emulate a vintage compressor. But the soft mode I like to use with the Vintage Opto and the different VCA options. The hard mode I like to use with the 2 FET models, the 1176s. In Logic's manual, it actually says on the hard distortion, it emulates a transistor effect. And because the 1176s are using field effect transistors, I feel like this makes sense to use with those 2 models in order to get some of that 1176 style saturation. They may not be the most faithful recreations of analog compressors, but there's no doubt that they are very versatile and useful across your mixes and productions, all without having to spend hundreds for other plugin emulations or thousands for the real deal. I hope you found this video interesting. Let me know in the comments below what other analog modeling plugins you would like me to analyze in future episodes of this series. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you at the studio next time. Thanks.